Please welcome Mika Barber, who is speaking about navigating COVID-related grief with our kids.
Thank you, Maggie. I'm incredibly honored to be following Dr. Lisa D'Amour today, and I'm honored to be here today speaking with you about grief. I'd like to talk to you today about what grief is, about how it's shown up for us and for our kids in the last year and a half due to COVID and the global pandemic. And then I'd also like to give you some tips as parents about what we can do to support our kids in grief. So first of all, what do you think about when you hear the word grief? What comes to mind? Most people say either death or divorce. And I'd like to just take a moment and send my heartfelt condolences to anyone who has lost someone in the last year and a half due to COVID and the global pandemic. And death and divorce are definitely things that are related to grief. But there's also many other losses related to grief. And in this work, there's over 40 losses defined that can cause a person to grieve. First, I want to give you a definition of grief. So if you're taking notes, this is a great thing to write down. Grief is the natural and normal reaction to loss of any kind. And in those 40 losses that I mentioned, there's both primary and secondary losses. So primary losses are things that are tangible, things like the loss of a loved one, the loss of a relationship, moving, the loss of a job. The primary losses are things that are very tangible. So it's something that was there, and then it's the absence of that thing. They're easy to identify. But along with the primary losses come secondary losses. The secondary losses are intangible things, and they're harder to identify. So some examples of secondary losses are things like the loss of trust, or the loss of our sense of security, or the loss of a sense of safety. So I want to give you some examples that are related to COVID and the pandemic, things that our kids have experienced over the last year and a half. So the primary losses are things like the loss of routine of going to school, or the loss of our routine with our kids participating in sports, their hobbies, their passions, their activities that they are used to attending, the loss of those things, the loss of social connection and social gathering. Those are the primary losses. And of course, if you lost a loved one, but the secondary losses that came along with the pandemic are just abundant. There's almost too many to list. And those are things like the loss of our sense of certainty in the world, that we had maybe a sense of control or a sense of certainty about how the world, was going to go for us. Our loss of trust in again, our sense of certainty, but there's sort of a sense of loss of trust. Maybe our loss of safety or a loss of security. Perhaps our kids lost their sense of belonging as they had to disconnect from all of these familiar patterns. And so it's just important to know that both the primary and secondary losses that came along with COVID are extensive. I want to expand the definition of grief that I gave you. And this is another good thing to write down if you're someone taking notes. Grief is the conflicting feelings caused by an end or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So let me say it again. Grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So let's dissect that definition for just a minute. If we're looking at it just as if grief is caused by a change in a familiar pattern of behavior, we can see that there has been so much change in the last year and a half, right? I mean, the whole world has changed as we know it, and so many of our familiar patterns of behavior have changed. The next thing in that definition that's important is the word conflicting. So grief is often a mixed bag of emotions, and that's what can make grief hard to identify and also hard to work through. So I want to give you some examples related to COVID and the pandemic, and as you know, everything was changing for our kids. When our country specifically went into lockdown, and many of our kids were sent home from school, for many kids that may have been exciting, even, right? School's canceled. This is sort of a good thing. I'm sure many kids felt that way. We get to sleep in, we maybe get to wear our pajamas all day. There could have been some excitement around that. In addition, they were losing social connection to their friends, their connection to their sports and activities and organizations that they belong to. And so there was conflicting feelings. On one hand, they're feeling excited. On the other hand, they're feeling the disappointment and the sadness of everything changing. Another example, I think that many people I know felt some relief in this great pause that was happening in the world. Of course, if you were a frontline worker or an essential worker, anyone in the medical field was probably not feeling that. But for some people, there was this great pause that was happening. Everyone was sent home. We're now, at home with our families. Many of our social obligations in the world came to a halt. And for some people, that felt like relief. At the same time, we're feeling angst and anxious about this virus that's circulating in the world. And our kids were feeling anxious about that. Maybe we have grandparents who were at great risk, aging parents, or we have a family member who has an underlying health condition who was also at risk. And so again, we're feeling this conflicting emotion. We're feeling maybe some relief about some parts of this, and then we're feeling a lot of angst and anxiety. And it's often how grief is created, and it's often a important symptom of grief, is the confliction of feeling. So what's important to know about grief is that it is an incredibly overlooked and neglected process in our culture and in many cultures. And there's a lot of misconception around grief, and there's some myths that we perpetuate for each other, and oftentimes we perpetuate for our kids. So I want to touch on a few of the myths. The first one I want to mention is something I know we've all heard, and that is that time heals all wounds. And I know we've heard this, right? Things get better with time. Time heals all. Time will heal. Time will make things better. And it just isn't. It isn't true. It simply isn't true. And time alone will not heal. Being an active participant in our healing and in our grief will help us heal through grief, but time alone will not heal. A lot of times we suppress, or if we're harboring feelings around grief, over time, those things just fester, and then they come out in destructive ways or in unhealthy behaviors. So that's an important myth to look out for. Another one that we hear a lot is to stay strong. When we're facing adversity in our life, we often hear this, or we tell each other this, right? To just stay strong, be strong for others. And I think as parents, we definitely take that on. We have to be strong for our kids. But the term stay strong to me is just another way of saying stay stuck in your emotion. It's a way that we disconnect from what we're really feeling. It's a way that we sort of armor up and withstand whatever life's throwing at us in a way that we just, sort of white knuckle our way through without really feeling what's happening inside. Another one that we perpetuate often, accidentally, as parents to our kids, is the idea that we must grieve alone. And here's how we perpetuate this. As parents, we often feel that if we're emotional, right? If we're upset, if we're crying, if we're worried, then it's something we should not do in front of our kids. We should go behind closed doors. We should wait till they're not around, and we should navigate those emotions alone. And so when our kids don't see us in our emotion, then we're sending an indirect message to them that they have to deal with their emotions alone as well. So it's another important myth around grief. I want to give you a visual. Imagine a tea kettle on a hot stove. So there's a hot flame underneath this tea kettle, okay? And as the water boils, there's a certain amount of steam generated. And typically the steam would escape a little bit at a time through the spout. And it would even whistle, right? And alert us and notify us that the water was boiling. Now I want you to imagine a cork. And the cork represents the myths around grief and the misconceptions in our culture around grief. And imagine sticking that cork in the spout of the tea kettle. So what's going to happen to the steam? Where is it going to go? Okay, this is an important thing to be aware of. And I want to introduce you to a concept. This is another important thing for note takers. The concept of STIRBs. So STIRB is an acronym, and it stands for short-term energy relieving behavior. Okay, so STIRB, short-term energy relieving behavior. And what happens to that tea kettle and that steam inside when we cork it is that steam and that energy has to go somewhere. And this is where STIRBs come in. And these are ways that we disconnect from the feelings inside and that we find ways to relieve some of that pressure and that tension. But it's a short-term solution to a long-term problem. We're not getting to the root of the problem when we participate in a STIRB. So what is a STIRB? A STIRB is something that disconnects us from our emotions. So it can be something like excessively scrolling social media, Netflix binging. It can be overeating. It can be exercising. It can be working, gambling, drugs and alcohol, shopping. We call that retail therapy, right? And some of these things are essential, and we all participate in these things, but it's when we're participating in them in an obsessive or excessive way to disconnect from our emotions. So it's an important thing to look out for as a parent with your child. So now that I think we can agree that we are in collective grief, that our world is in a collective grieving period, and our kids on some level are likely grieving. Okay, so what do we do about that as parents? Well, first of all, don't panic, okay? Because grief is a part of life. If there is life, there is grief. If there is love, there is grief. And we know that this may not be the first time your child has been grieving, but definitely it is not the last, because grief is a part of life. And so I see this as an opportunity. I really see this as an opportunity for us as parents to teach our children some amazing skills and give them some tools to navigate grief. So what can we do? The first thing is acknowledge and recognize that we are in grief and that our kids are in grief. An incredible brain scientist and mentor of mine, Daniel Siegel, he's an author and a very well-known author and brain researcher, has a simple phrase that is so powerful. He says, name it to tame it. And once we can identify and name what's happening inside us, so much of the power dissipates. And it's a powerful tool to use with our kids. So if we can help them recognize that there is grief and that we are all in a collective grief, that is the first step. The second thing is go first, okay? Be emotionally honest with your children about what you're grieving, about how you're feeling. Share with them the things you're missing about, pre-COVID life. Share with them the things that are pulling on your heartstrings. Be emotionally honest with them. It gives them permission to be emotionally honest, first with themselves, but then also with you. And don't let them grieve alone, right? So share the emotional honesty of the situation with each other. And another quote that I love comes from Gabor Mate. He's a trauma specialist, and he says children are not traumatized by things that hurt them. They're traumatized when they're left alone with those hurtful feelings. So don't let your kids grieve alone. The next thing I want to say is that don't perpetuate the myths, right? Don't perpetuate those things about the misconceptions in our culture around grief. And finally, I just want to end with my favorite quote about grief. Comes from an author, David Kessler, who wrote a book called Finding Meaning. And he says, our grief doesn't get smaller, we get bigger. And I think this is the most poignant thing I've ever heard about grief, because it's true. Grief gives us the opportunity to expand around the discomfort of our feelings. And I think this time is a time of expansion, not only for us, but for our children. And so we can expand our capability to hold our emotion. And it gives us a broader range and a broader depth of emotional capacity. So I want to leave you with that. If there's anyone that wants to go deeper into grief, into studying grief, I have some courses coming up this fall, both for adults and working through their personal grief, and then for adults who want to help the children in their care around grief. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mika. I love the idea of noticing our children's emotional energy, as well as knowing that our kids need our help in being in grief. The idea that our grief doesn't get smaller, that we get bigger, is powerful and encouraging.